Hi, and welcome to the Animal Training Academy podcast show, the show for animal training and behavior nerds, where I, Ryan Cartledge, interview the world's most proficient animal training and behavior geeks. We're absolutely thrilled and grateful to have you here with us today. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on whatever you're listening to this on so that you don't miss a single episode. Each episode of this show is brought to you on behalf of the ATA membership. And if you like the conversations in this episode, then you're invited to continue them with like-minded behavior nerds within the membership area, which you can find out more about at www.animaltrainingacademy.com. You'll get access to twice monthly live web classes, the back catalogue of previous web class replays, plus a huge library of videos and projects to help problem solve your training challenges. Plus, we're a sociable bunch with an exclusive private Facebook group and forum areas. It's like a Netflix social media platform for animal behavior geeks. But we will start today's bonus episode where I'm super excited to welcome back to the ATA podcast show the awesome Dr. Erika Feuerbacher. Erika is an associate professor of companion animal behavior and welfare at Virginia Tech and director of the Applied Animal Behavior and Welfare Lab in the School of Animal Science. She earned her Ph.D. in psychology at the University of Florida in the UF Canine, Cognition and Behavior Lab, and her master's in behavior analysis at the University of North Texas in the Organization for Reinforcement Contingencies with Animals. She's worked as a shelter behavior consultant, offered group dog training classes and private behavior consultations, and is co-founder of the Institute for Shelter Dogs. She is also a certified applied animal behaviorist, a board certified behavior analyst, and a certified professional dog trainer. Her research at Virginia Tech focuses on understanding dog behavior and learning from a behavior analytic perspective, using applied behavior analysis to solve behavioral issues and identifying interventions that improve shelter dog welfare. She has earned several awards for her behavior analytic research and dedication to the theoretical foundations of behavior analysis. In addition, she is passionate about humane, effective animal training and working with owners, trainers, and shelter staff to improve our interactions with animals through behavior analysis. So without further ado, it's my very great pleasure to welcome Erika back to the show today, who's patiently waiting by. Erika, thank you so much for taking the time to come and hang out with us again at Animal Training Academy.
Thanks for having me. It's always fun to chat with you, so I'm really pleased to be back.
So Erika, the listeners of this show, they really want to master their animal training skills, and that in order to do this as professional trainers, we really need a broad knowledge and experience base. And this is one of the reasons our audience loves conferences. And I get super excited when I hear about up-and-coming events. Not only do these events provide opportunities to up your knowledge significantly, we also leave brimming with inspiration and hopefully with lots of new Facebook friends. And so to get us started today, Erika, I was hoping you could share with the listeners about a very exciting event happening literally next week, the Canine Science Symposium. Where is it? What is it? And how can people attend?
Sure. Yes, we are hosting the 9th Canine Science Symposium. It's in San Francisco, but this year we're really excited to offer Zoom options as well. So you can sit from the comfort of your home and hear some incredible scientific speakers. You mentioned our need for broad knowledge of the science of behavior, and that's what we're really excited about with this symposium is that we bring in a whole variety of folks, from folks like me that have a strong background in learning theory to Angela Perry, who studies dog genetics, and Sarah Marshall-Pacini, who studies wolf dog behaviors over in Vienna. So it's a really, broad conference. You're going to get a lot of information about dog behavior that we hope you can apply with your clients and improve your practice.
And just in case anyone's listening that might attend in person, and so sure, if they want to do the Zoom session, where can they go to do that, to register? And you can maybe share the URL for you've got a conference website set up, haven't you? So they can go and see the speakers and the topics.
Exactly. Yeah. So our conference URL is just the name, caninesciencesymposium.com. And you can find out there all the registration information about attending in person if you're able to join us in San Francisco, or the Zoom options, as well as the agenda. You'll see who the speakers are and what they're going to be speaking about.
Awesome. So if this sounds like you, which for most of you it does, then head to caninesciencesymposium.com.
That's right.
Click the big register button. Is there a big
please.
register button?
Yes, there'll be a big register button on there, and it has all the information on there. And like I said, you can see who our wonderful speakers are and the topics they're going to be presenting on.
Right, and so there's obviously Zoom sessions people can attend from anywhere in the world, and they can just put their credit card in, pay PayPal. Like how do you pay for the conference?
Yes, you can pay by credit card. This is run through Virginia Tech, and unfortunately, we can't take PayPal currently.
Right, okay.
They're working on it, but credit cards, yes, all of those are welcome.
Awesome. And then get registered, watch the conference, improve your knowledge, and have your biggest possible impact on all of the dogs and humans you work with. Awesome. And firstly, thank you so much for sharing all of that. We're going to link to all of that in the show notes. Erica, you are presenting 2 papers at this conference, I understand.
That's right. Yeah. So I'm going to be talking about a lot of our work looking at social interaction as a reinforcer for dogs. And of course, it's always a hot button issue is aversive control in dogs. So we're going to be talking about what we know and some of what we don't know about the operant and Pavlovian effects of aversive control on our dog's behavior.
Right. So that paper specifically is called Let's Talk About Prong and Shock Collars, a review of what we know about operant and Pavlovian effects of aversive control. Now, just that title alone will probably elicit some rather strong emotions in the listeners of this show. We know that the frequency of use of those tools by some individuals is high, and it can be tough to see and stressful even to know that it's happening. And as professionals, we often deal with the fallout of these tools being used when clients come to us after the fact of having already used them or having had someone else use them on their dog. People in some parts of the world, they were celebrating them being banned in their locality, whilst I know here in New Zealand, for example, that's not on the cards yet, unfortunately. As a certified trainer, Erica, I know you understand this dilemma. But it's important to you to make sure that we are educated when forming opinions and talking to others about these tools. Have I kind of understood the point of the paper? Yeah,
you're right. I mean, I think we get a lot of emotion going, and I do as well. I find it hard to see dogs that are incredibly stressed and look very unhappy. That is oftentimes not enough for us, or at least not enough to talk to owners about sometimes. And so we'll talk a little bit about the welfare implications, what we know about that from science, but also what we know about like I said, the operant and Pavlovian, because I think those are, really where the rubber hits the road, that the operant, the reduction of behavior, the frequency of behavior could be okay. But I think we see, as you mentioned, a lot of behavioral fallout from the Pavlovian side effects of that. And really understanding what they are, and the as much as we know, the conditions under which those things can be better or worse, I think are really useful. And trying to, I have a hard time pulling my emotion back out of it, but trying to just look at the science and what we know, and also acknowledging the things that we don't know that we really ought to study. I think there are a lot of questions about, if we're putting these on dogs that are potentially dangerous, and you'll hear the argument that folks are saving their lives by doing this. Well, I would like to see the data. And I think that's, where a lot of this comes down to is, maybe they're right, but I would love to see the data that suggests that those dogs are having good welfare and that those behaviors do not crop up again in dangerous situations. But I think as practitioners, we see just a lot of fallout from this, and I think the data might not be there actually to support those sentiments that that you're saving lives all the time. But again, I follow the data, and we just need a lot more of it.
I love that. That makes a lot of sense, and I don't think anyone can argue with it. I'm going to read the synopsis that's available on the website. So if you head to caninesciencesymposium.com and you look down to the run sheet, if that's a good word to describe it, who's talking on what day, etc., about what. You click on the title of the paper and it will come up with the synopsis. Prong collars, shock collars, and other aversive devices are still common in dog training. In light of recent discussions on banning them, reviewing what we know about aversive control is warranted. We will delve back into old operant and Pavlovian studies of aversive control to look at main effects, side effects, and issues of aversive control, and extrapolate those studies to dog training. We will also briefly discuss more recent studies assessing welfare implications of these techniques. So I am curious, Erica, if for someone coming to the conference either in person or watching the Zoom session, can you share maybe the top 3 things you want those who watch the presentation to take away / learn in terms of what you're going to share about the literature so far?
Yes, I think some of the things they'll see is that a lot of the literature looking at the effects of punishment occurred way back when, in like the 1960s and 70s. That literature was driven a lot by our need for behavior change mechanisms for humans. And certainly these techniques have fallen out of favor with use with humans, which I think is rightly so. But we're still having this discussion in the dog world. And so one, we'll see some really interesting literature looking at the effects of schedules of punishment, the intensity of the punisher and how it's delivered, competing reinforcers and how that affects the efficacy of punishment, that I think really give us a broader view of when could punishment work, and all the kind of pitfalls that we run up against, especially working with clients that are not going to have great schedules of punishment. They're going to let a lot of behaviors slip through, and we'll see that is not very effective. So I think it's a nice opening into all the factors that can influence how punishment works and why we have so much problem kind of delivering it effectively, especially with clients. And then on the Pavlovian side, there's a huge literature that we won't have time to get into thoroughly in fear conditioning, but we'll go over kind of what we know, looking at some of those side effects of shock-induced aggression and other issues like that. And then, of course, we'll talk about some welfare implications. This is a tricky subject to study, and that's why I feel like a lot of the literature dances around the issue more recently, especially with dogs, because while folks will still put these devices on dogs to train them, as a scientist, it's unethical to submit dogs to these sorts of experiences for data collection. And then, so our other option is to use dogs that are already experiencing this and use them as, our evidence. The problem, of course, is that there are some potential confounds there. That might be a select group. There are challenges of how do you study this when you're looking at the effects of positive reinforcement versus positive punishment. Usually people are not skilled in both of those training domains. So you can't have the same person training in both conditions because they might be better in one than other. But then, if you have two people, one that's skilled in positive reinforcement and one that's skilled in using the punishers, how do you equate their skill levels? So, it's a tricky domain to look at experimentally. We end up with dogs finding a lot of correlational evidence. And what we're trying to find and what we'll talk about is sort of the confluence of evidence that is coming together from all these different studies that kind of all point the same direction, even though they're not as experimentally rigorous as we could do because of ethical considerations.
Yeah, right. So the lack of recent literature is due to the change in.
Yeah, at least in the experimental world, there's a lack of continued studies on punishment. So we usually have to look back at Nate Azrin's work from the 60s and 70s to get an idea of that. It would be great. While I don't want to deliver the punishers to animals, I think there's certainly a need because folks are still using it inappropriately. Punishment happens in the world, and figuring out, what are the actual effects of it and what are some ways, good ways of avoiding using that, I think would be really useful. In the dog domain, we have seen a lot of recent papers looking at the effectiveness of these training techniques and their correlation with problem behaviors, their correlation with owner-dog relationships. Most of those, however, are still correlational, again, because of the ethical issues surrounding putting a shock collar on a dog that wasn't going to have a shock collar on it otherwise.
For those listening who might not understand, when you say those are still correlational, can you unpack that and help us understand what you mean when you say that?
Yeah, sure. So in those studies, we are not experimentally manipulating. What we would want to do in a really well-controlled experimental study is to gather up a bunch of dogs and randomly assign them to a group that receives shock and a group that receives food as a reinforcer, and look at the effects. How well do they learn? What are their side effect behaviors, things like that. That's where we are controlling the history, the delivery of those two things to the dogs. As I mentioned, that's, it's unethical to say, hey, we're going to recruit your dog and now we're going to put a shock collar on it. So what we're usually left with is finding dogs that have had shock collars on them, finding folks that report having used these training techniques, and then assessing their dog on different behavioral tasks, like how sociable is the dog, how much does the dog play with the owner, or asking the owner about the dog's behavior. And so there, our problem comes out that we can say, and there is a paper that shows this, that dogs whose owners report the dog has received more punishment also report the dog has more behavioral issues, because we didn't experimentally give those dogs that history of shock and then measure their number of problem behaviors. It might suggest that putting those devices on dogs could produce more problem behaviors. The other possibility is that dogs whose owners decided to opt for that training technique were dogs that already had more problem behaviors. So it doesn't allow us to look at the cause that shock does X or food does Y. We just have to find these dogs and their confounds in that sort of study. But I think the more studies that are coming out that pull from different populations and are still seeing similar evidence, I think that starts to add to our story, even without having to do this experimental work.
So how do we view that old literature? Are we like, oh, poor animals that had to go through that, or are we grateful for that period of time? Like, that's a weird. I was just thinking about that. That's a weird kind of.
It is, it's one of those where I think maybe we hold both. Of like, I do feel badly for the animals that experience that, and the nicest thing about at least the behavior analytic research is that they do within subject studies. So the study, single subject studies. So the studies use very few subjects, which is better than a group design study. And we can get a lot of information from just a few animals. What I hope is that what those animals offered to us in science can be used for good to prevent and reduce suffering of other animals going forward. So it's a little bit of a utilitarian argument, but I'm with you. I feel horribly for the animals' experience, and also grateful that we have more knowledge that we can try and use to prevent other animals from experiencing that.
And you have to correct my terminology. The single design study, did you say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, single subject designs.
Single subject. That's the word I was missing. So then with science, for something what's the opposite of correlational? Causational?
Mm-hmm. Yep, causational.
So to say that something's causational, we need replication of studies, right? Does that pose a problem then when thinking about that early research, that we've only got this tiny little pool, and therefore from the science lens, how do we look at that from the science lens? What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. So some of these studies do have replication across animals. They'll have a couple animals in the study, but not as many as we need for group designs. And they're also really good at showing replication within an animal. So you can kind of show the effect, eliminate the effect with a change in your conditions, show the effect again. So we can get away with fewer animals, which is great. But I think you bring up a really important point that a lot of these studies were on shock. And we know that there are lots of other aversives out there and different intensities of aversives, and those haven't been studied very well at all. You can find some literature where they're using like an obnoxious noise as a punisher or an obnoxious spray as a punisher. Those were usually done with humans or lab animals. So, it takes a little extrapolation to the dogs, and certainly their sensitivities for noises and smells and things like that could be very different. But I think your point is great, that we have this like nugget of information, but we really need more, especially looking at things like lower intensity things like, what if I put, a harness on my dog and that pressure, does that produce the same side effects as a prong collar? I suspect not. If they had the same behavioral outcome operantly of reducing pulling behavior, we'd say they're both punishers, but the side effects of those could be very different. And I think there's still a lot of nuance to understand there.
Right. So I've already learned a lot in the last 10 minutes. And so can I appreciate that people who come and actually watch your talk are going to really help me phrase this. Is it really build on their story? I know you used those words before, but how do we take this information, this gap, this unfillable gap? Is that a correct way of saying it?
Yeah.
And how do we take that into our practical application as we use words to converse with other human learners to try and get behavior change in them to use more desirable tools?
Right. Yeah. So, I think some of the things that I hope folks can take away are being sensitive to their learner, and that they're recognizing that, even, for some dogs, a harness might be too aversive. And so really kind of listening to what their learner is telling them and making changes based on their learner's behavior, being really sensitive to that rather than having sort of these blanket interventions. And what I hope also is that they will have some tools to talk about with their clients that, oftentimes we get called into the client, all they want is for a behavior to stop. And so they're thinking of how to punish this behavior, right? They want to know how to stop that behavior. And hopefully this will give folks some tools to talk about some of the potential side effects of these tools. That maybe that will effectively reduce your dog's pulling, but what else is it learning? It's not just learning that. Is it learning that when it sees dogs on coming down the street, that it feels, unpleasant pressure on its neck? Is that going to change its feelings towards those dogs? And so I think hopefully that will give folks a number of different angles to discuss it with their clients, because different things resonate with different clients. Some are going to be sensitive to their dog's welfare. Some are going to be sensitive to the efficacy of the tools themselves, or the challenges in using those tools appropriately, and then just having them be on the abusive side, right? That you're putting unpleasant things on your animals and not having the behavior change that you even wanted. So hopefully it'll give folks a number of different angles to discuss this issue from.
And I imagine if you want to justify your use of these tools, you could say, well, there's no science to say that there's anything bad with this, there's anything good with that. And so I'm wondering, is there a level of correlational studies where it tips to say there's enough here to say to attach the label or the word causational, or does it just stay in that correlational space forever?
I think the way we talk about it, we'll never be able to say causational, but I think we can say that there's such a confluence of evidence that all these things point the same direction. And that we're looking at dogs in different countries with folks that have different cultures and might be putting these tools on different dogs. And so we might be, our concern is always that when we look at these results, that maybe it's not due to the tools we're interested in, those aversive tools or not, but rather that the dogs themselves were somehow different and the dogs that had aversive tools put on them were different from the get-go. But I think once we get more and more countries, all of whom probably have different reasons or likelihoods of putting these tools on, that we're probably starting to get a broader and almost more random sample of dogs. We can't ever say that for sure, but I think, it starts to feel more clear that all of our evidence kind of points in one direction. And there are a couple of things that I think we could do also. It takes some of the folks that use these tools to being open to collecting data on them, is to actually, could we get in with those trainers and say, when this new dog comes to you as a client, I would like to do some tests on it beforehand and some behavioral assessments. I would like to monitor your training and see what other behaviors come out. I would like to follow up with that dog in 6 months or a year and see how the behavior is going and if new behaviors have emerged. So far, that has been very difficult to, people don't want their tools assessed, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking that as you were saying that, I was like, that's a vulnerable space to be in it, and that potentially bends the data towards like a certain type of person who might be more likely to use a certain type of tool. Once again,
yeah,
no data
exactly. Right. It becomes really challenging to do that. I think maybe we as scientists have to become more clever at, finding, could we identify dogs that are going to do that and, offering them some assessments before and then assessing after, or the folks that really put their money on these tools, I think should be open to data collection, but that is a hard sell for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting because the folks who really put their faith and their money on these tools is not just the trainers that are using these tools, it's the industry that makes the tools and has a function of making money. Do they have an influence in the science literature? Are they trying to sway opinion there?
I haven't seen any of that. I think every once in a while I will see a company that, for example, I think there was a company that did invisible fences that were trying to partner with folks to assess that. But I generally don't see a lot of those companies reaching out to say, are our tools, A, being used the way we think they should be, B, having the effect that we say they will, or C, having effects that are really, damaging the human-animal relationship that they don't acknowledge. So I don't see a lot of that. So it's usually, the scientists kind of, pushing for that and trying to find ways to work around kind of a closed system. So far anyway.
So we know that individuals are using them, and depending on where you live, the frequency and their number and even the ability to use them is going to be different. But we generally speaking, have a lot of emotions attached to seeing this, and even though it's happening, and you're in a great position to understand that because you're in the academic space and you're a certified dog trainer. And you're sharing this paper to educate us as to what the actual data is. And I think you said there's such a confluence of correlational studies. How can you layman term that for us? Not that we, the listeners of the show, I think need it, but help us provide some tools maybe where we can speak to others who might, when we say that, go, I'm going to burn too many brain calories here, I'm leaving.
Yeah, so there are a number of unethical studies to run. The one that's always called the forbidden experiment is taking a human baby away and raising them alone and seeing like, well, what social deficits do they have? What learning deficits do they have? It's unethical. We couldn't do that, and so we end up finding these unfortunate children that were raised that way. They'll call them wild child or a feral child, and then studying them. And so from those studies, we get, when folks find these unfortunate individuals and they study them, we just start to get more and more information about, what deficits do they have? How well could they have been remediated once, they got into better circumstances? At what age do we think they encountered these unfortunate circumstances, and how did, what do we know about developmental issues from children, and start to form a picture of that. And that's kind of what we're doing, that folks are doing with these studies is, they're asking questions in slightly different ways. So some studies will ask owners about the frequency of problem behaviors that they see in their dogs or they report. Others will do direct observation and say, we're going to come in and we want to see how much does your dog play with you when you try and play with your dog? Or if you're to train a new dog on a novel task, how quickly does your dog learn that? And then also ask about their use of positive reinforcement or aversive methods. And so everybody's kind of asking questions with different dog populations and asking questions in slightly different ways. And hopefully what is always nice for science is when all those things kind of point in the same direction, that yes, we couldn't ever do that unethical experimental study, but asking these questions in all these different ways and looking at behavioral measures and physiological measures, if they all kind of give us a similar story, then we feel more confident in that story. If there are threads of that or pieces of data that don't fit in that, then that, we need to start to understand why that didn't fit with what we thought or what we know from these other studies. What's the difference? But we can, from a range of those studies, start to feel more confident in our conclusions about what's going on.
Awesome. And we talk about confidence a lot on this show. And as dog trainers, sometimes we wonder if we're good enough to be dog trainers. and so
Right.
and so offering a paper like this to help give confidence is a great gift to our community, I think. So if you're listening, if this sounds like something you want to understand more and learn about, head to caninesciencesymposium.com, hit that register button, get your links, go to Erica's presentation, grow your confidence as an animal trainer, and continue to have your biggest possible positive impact on the lives of the dogs, other animals, and humans you work with. Hey, thank you so much for sharing all of that, Erica. I'm really keen to talk about your other presentation as well. This one's called Social Interaction as a Reinforcer for Dogs: What, When, and How to Use It. And sometimes when working with any learner, most of the time, our normal go-to reinforcer of food is food, but sometimes that might not be feasible for various reasons. Maybe we have clients who are reluctant to use food, or a learner who's just not motivated by food in the context that we're trying to use it. And this situation can be pretty stressful for trainers, because what do we do there? Again, your work as a certified trainer, I appreciate that you really understand all of this, and therefore in this paper, you're going to draw from the literature as well and explore social interaction as a reinforcer. Have I got that right?
Yes, yeah, that's right. I started looking at social interaction as a reinforcer for dogs when I was working on my Ph.D. And despite our longstanding history with dogs and our fascination with them, there's some strange holes in our literature about dogs and humans, including what do dogs like about us? What interactions do they prefer from us? And so I've done a lot of studies looking at, their preference for food or petting or social or vocal praise. But also, as you mentioned, because I'm a trainer and I'm always got an eye to how are people going to be able to use this to improve their relationships and with their dogs and their dogs' behavior, is always looking at the reinforcer side, and do these function as a reinforcer. In our first study, we didn't really find much evidence that brief 4 seconds of vocal praise and petting functioned as a reinforcer. But I didn't think that was the whole story. And so more recently, we've published another paper exploring social interaction a little bit more and identifying that, yes, it can, but function as a reinforcer. But there might be some parameters that are important to consider for it to function as effectively as it can. Nonetheless, even in that study, we see that food is still likely a more effective reinforcer for at least the dogs we've tested. So our choice of food is certainly backed up by data.
And so you mentioned there's some important parameters which influence that. What are they, can I ask?
Yeah, the ones that we think might matter based on the differences differences between our first study and this most recent study is how frequently we're delivering the social interaction. That in that first study where we didn't see much of an effect, we were running our sessions and our trials back to back to back to back. And this time we capped the number of trials in each session, and we spread our sessions out across the day, so at least 30 minutes in between them, and studied the dogs across multiple days. That's where we started to see an effect. My suspicion is that dogs might satiate on it fairly quickly. Even though we used an easy response, just a nose touch to our hand, it's still an active response. And so I think there are other things that we can still explore and hope to in the future of looking at, well, what if it's what if we're trying to reinforce calm behavior? Maybe a passive response is going to be more effectively reinforced by social interaction. So I think there's a lot more to look at there, but we are finding evidence of like, okay, under these conditions, this can function. And maybe that gives some guidance to folks on how to use it in the real world.
Well, you might have already answered this, but again, I'd love to hear for those who are thinking about registering, or maybe who have already registered and just are very much looking forward to the conference starting in 5 days from the release of this episode, or 6 days. If they're going to come along and they're going to watch this presentation of yours, what are the top 3 things in your mind you want people who watch the presentation to take away, learn, and the reason of getting a broad knowledge for a lot of people is to have the skill that follows that, hopefully, through practical application. So what do you want them to take away, learn, and then apply?
Yeah, so I'm hoping that, they recognize that social interaction can function as a reinforcer, but maybe not under all conditions. And so there could be some limitations to that. And that at the end of the day, for most dogs, the food is going to be a more effective reinforcer. We're going to see faster responding, more consistent responding for food. So our choice of that, like I said, is certainly warranted. We have data to back that up. And we'll also explore, access to the owner as a reinforcer, that being able to be with their person is likely a reinforcer. And I think that speaks to, training issues of, if we happen to be on the other side of a door and our dog is barking at us and we don't want barking, that, maybe we do have to try and enter when the dog is calm. But I think it also, we haven't gone this direction, but I think it'd be fun too, is looking at the welfare implications. If being with us is so reinforcing, how stressful is it to separate from us? And certainly we see that showing up in separation anxiety. But even maybe some of our dogs that aren't showing that, might have some welfare issues there as well. We've selected lovely pack animals and then we leave them to go to work.
So you mentioned that you changed the types of trials you were doing. When was this research? What's the timeline of the different research you've done?
Yeah, so our first study was published in 2012, and we've been sort of picking at this a little bit, and we had picked it up again right before COVID hit. And so then it got put on the back burner, and we were using shelter dogs, and then we weren't able to go to the shelter anymore. So one of my students continued working with owned dogs. And so this paper came out earlier this year in 2023, but we've been collecting the data for the past sort of two years on it.
Cool, because I can't remember the date, but I know you shared some of this in a session you did for our Animal Training Academy members. So
yeah, exactly.
That's why I was asking. It was just a self-indulgent question. I was wondering if there'd been more since then, but now you answered.
Yeah,
it has.
We added, right, exactly. So what I shared, we finished up data collection this past winter, and so what I had then, you'll see in the paper, and then we've added an additional phase of the experiment on there, we compared 4 seconds and 30 seconds of social interaction to extinction. And then in that last study, we actually put them right next to each other to see if we could detect differences between their reinforcing value for the dogs. And then finally added food back in as a final comparison. So we've got some more data in there for you to see.
And curious, your motivation behind studying this. Is it because you saw a problem that you wanted to find some data to help try and solve, or you just, they're probably, I think there are 2 things that really made this important to me. One is the training side, and I really want to find effective reinforcers and understand when do they function as reinforcers, how valuable are they,
behavior. And I'm always surprised that there hadn't been more research on that, because we as trainers are, struggling sometimes to find effective reinforcers for a certain dog, or trying to convince owners that their reinforcers, what they want to use, are really not that effective. And so having some data behind us is always useful. The social interaction side is, and a lot of my studies on preference are really because I want to be a better person to my dogs, and I really want to know what they like about me. I just want them to hang out with me all the time. So I want to understand better, like, what do you like about me? What can I offer you? And hopefully share that with other folks so that they are providing interactions that are meaningful to their dogs, and that their dogs are really enjoying, and that they're getting, if they are trying to train with those interactions, that they're seeing, effective behavior change from it rather than not.
I mean, when someone's reading your paper and you're using the term social interactions, what definition do you give in the paper of what that means? Because, I mean, for anyone listening to this, I'm sure there's probably 1,000 different definitions floating around in people's heads.
Exactly. Yeah, we have been using vocal praise, and if it's an owned dog, we've told the owner to praise them as they normally have, and petting. And the petting is not just like pat, pat, pat. It's kind of just getting your fingers in there and kind of doing some scritchies. So really kind of getting down to the skin and scritching them. We let the dogs adjust themselves. So when they come over, we pet the part that is closest to us. So if they want their bottom scratched, then they can position themselves that way. But you're right, there is a whole realm. Our papers are one of the few looking at social interaction as a reinforcer. There's really only a few others that I can think of from way back when that have investigated this. And there's just a huge expanse still to be studied of what does the petting actually look like? What if we change the topography of our petting? What if we did like non-object play with our dogs and tried to bounce around with them? What if we engaged in toy play with our dogs? Those we haven't explored. And so this is, a limited definition, but one that I think a lot of kind of lay owners try and use as a way to maintain good behavior in their dogs, which might or might not be very effective for them.
Yeah, I think we can understand that. And so you talked about scritches. And do you explore tonality and the way vocal interaction is offered?
We haven't yet. So we haven't looked at modulating the vocal praise. We try and keep it high pitched and excited. When we're working with shelter dogs with owners, as I mentioned, we just tell the owners to praise the dogs the way they normally do, hoping that if anything has become conditioned as a conditioned reinforcer for their dogs. But there is a whole range of things to look at, different types of petting, different tones of and expressions of vocal praise for sure. And I'm going to be talking about this one at another conference in Austria. So if you happen to be over in Austria, I will be over there in June with Dr. Nicole Fowler-Sadowski and her partner Gernot Sadowski. They're putting it on. So you can look for that one too. And I'll be talking about some social reinforcement as well as desensitization and counter conditioning, another hot topic.
Yeah, and you can actually listen to the organizer of that conference, Nicole, in episode 197 and 198 of this show, and head to her website as well. We're going to be talking more about that conference soon with another guest shortly. So very cool that you get to travel to Austria.
Yes, they're wonderful to hang out with, and then a beautiful country to visit.
And so remind everyone listening where they can go next week to tune into, or in person, to tune into the Canine Science Symposium conference. Remind them of the website, what to do, and what they can find when they head to the website.
Yeah, so our website for that is the caninesciencesymposium.com, and you should find a registration button there. You can register for in-person to join us in San Francisco, which is always lovely. Or if you can't get over to California, which can be understandable, we do have a Zoom option, so you can listen from the comfort of your home as well.
Awesome. And we will, of course, link to all of that in the show note. This has been so much fun, Erica. So from myself and on behalf of everyone listening, thank you. We really appreciate you taking the time to come and hang out with us again at Animal Training Academy. Much appreciated.
My pleasure. It's always fun talking to you, and I really enjoy your academy and your folks in it. That's a great community you've developed.
We do, of course, really appreciate all of you tuning in today as well. And if you have enjoyed this episode and you were interested in carrying on the conversation about working with our animals in the most positive, funnest, choice-rich ways, then as mentioned at the start of this episode, the Animal Training Academy community is waiting for you. Head on over to www.animaltrainingacademy.com and click on the membership button in the main menu to learn more about what members are describing as the Netflix social media platform for behavior geeks. That's it for this episode though. We're going to wrap it up there. Thanks again so much everyone for listening. You'll hear from us again soon.